So guys, this is the only way I could read this. It's kind of a side angle. My wife's in Walmart, so I'm at the Walmart parking lot. Nothing happening. A hurricane's coming, so everyone's like all freaked out. I had reservations to go like to the south, and now I had to cancel. There's hurricanes coming, so I'm gonna do my video from here. And it's Guayabas. It's Guayabas. Okay, here we go. They emerged from the fig orchard and continued through a pear grove. When they came into the clearing, they saw Senor Rodriguez waiting with a lantern by the barn doors. They hurried inside. Pigeons fluttered in the rafters, and their wagon was waiting, surrounded by crates of green guavas. I like guava, like juice, but not eating them. My stomach doesn't agree. Anyway, no details. Did Marisol come? Asked Esperanza, her eyes searching the barn. I could tell no one about your departure, said Senor Rodriguez. When the time is right, I'll tell her that you looked for her and said goodbye. Now we must hurry. You need the protection of darkness. Alfonso Miguel and Senor Rodriguez had built another floor in the wagon, higher than the real one and open at the back with barely enough room between for Mama, Esperanza, and Hortensia to lie down, and Hortensia lined it with blankets. Esperanza had known about the plan, but now she hesitated when she saw the small space. Please, can I sit with Alfonso and Miguel? Mi hija, it is necessary, said Mama. There are too many bandits, said Alfonso. It is not safe for women to be on the roads at night, and besides, your uncles have many spies, remember? That is why we must take the wagon to Zacatecas and catch the train there instead of from Aguascalientes. Luis has bragged about the engagement to everyone, said Hortensia. Think how angry he will be when he discovers you have gone. We cannot take the chance of you being seen. Mama Hortensia said grateful goodbyes to Senor Rodriguez, then slid between the floors of the wagon. Esperanza reluctantly scooted on her back between them. When can we get out? Every few hours we will stop and stretch, said Mama. Esperanza stared at the wood planks just a few inches from her face. She could hear Alfonso, Miguel, and Senor Rodriguez dumping crate after crate of guavas onto the floor above them. The almost ripe fruit rolling and tumbling as it was piled on. The guavas smelled fresh and sweet, like pears and oranges all in one. Then she felt the guavas roll in around her feet as Alfonso and Miguel covered the opening. If anyone saw the wagon on the road, it would look like a farmer and his son taking a load of fruit to the market. Finally, this military guy won't turn his engine off. How are you? Alfonso asked, sounding far away. We are fine, called Hortensia. The wagon pulled out of the barn and the guavas shifted, then settled. It was dark inside, and it felt like someone was rocking them in a bumpy cradle, sometimes side to side and sometimes back and forth. Esperanza began to feel frightened. She knew that with a very few kicks of her feet she could get out, but still she felt trapped. Suddenly she thought she couldn't breathe. Mama, she said, gasping for air. Right here, Esperanza. Everything is fine. Do you remember, said Hortensia, taking her hand, when you were only 5 years old and we hid from the thieves? You were so brave for such a little girl. Your parents and Alfonso and the other servants had gone to town. It was just you and me and Miguel in the house, and we were in your bedroom, and I was pinning the hem of your beautiful blue silk dress. Do you remember that dress? You wanted it pinned higher so your new shoes would show. So now we have a kind of flashback, a story from the past. Esperanza's eyes were beginning to adjust to the darkness and to the pitch and roll of the wagon. Miguel ran into the house because he had seen bandits, said Esperanza, exhaling. She remembered standing on the chair with her arms outstretched like a bird ready for flight while Hortensia fitted the sides of the dress. And she remembered the new shoes, shiny and black. Yes, said Hortensia. I looked out the window to see 6 men, their faces covered with handkerchiefs, and they all held rifles. They were renegades who thought they had permission to steal from the rich and give to the poor, but they didn't always give to the poor, and they sometimes killed innocent people. We hid under the bed. said Esperanza, and we pulled down the bed covers so they couldn't see us. She remembered staring straight up at the bedboards, much like the boards enclosing them in the wagon now. She took another long breath. What we didn't know was that Miguel had a big field mouse in his pocket, said Hortensia. Yes, and he was going to scare me with it, said Esperanza. The wagon creaked and swayed. They could hear Alfonso and Miguel murmuring above them. The persistent smell of guavas filled their noses. Esperanza relaxed a little. Hortensia continued. The men came into the house, and we could hear them opening cupboards and stealing the silver. Then we heard them climb the stairs. 2 men came into the bedroom, and we saw their big boots through a crack in the bed cover. But we didn't say a word, until a pin poked me and I moved my leg and made a noise. I was so frightened that they would find us, said Hortensia, but Miguel pushed the mouse from under the bed, and it ran around the room. The men were startled, but started laughing. And then one of them said, It is just a raton. We've got plenty. Let's go. And they left early, said Esperanza. Mama said, They took almost all the silver, but Papa and I only cared that all of you were safe. Do you remember how Papa said that Miguel was very smart and brave and asked him what he wanted for protecting you, his most prized possession? Esperanza remembered. Miguel wanted to go on a train ride. Hortensia started to hum softly, and Mama held Esperanza's hand. Miguel's reward, that day-long train ride to Zacatecas, seemed like yesterday. Miguel had been 8 and Esperanza 5. She wore the beautiful blue silk dress and could still see Miguel standing at the station, wearing a bow tie and practically shining, as if Hortensia had cleaned and starched his entire body. Even his hair was slicked down smooth, and his eyes gleamed with excitement. He was mesmerized by the locomotive, watching it slowly pull in. Esperanza had been excited too. Russian lesson, locomotive, lokomotiv. When the train arrived, all sputtering and blustery, porters had hurried to escort them, showing them the way to their car, and Papa took her hand in Miguel's, and they boarded, waving goodbye to Alfonso and Hortensia. The compartment had seats of soft leather. She and Miguel had bounced happily upon them. Later they ate in the dining car at the little tables covered in white linens and set with silver and crystal. When the waiter came and asked if there was anything he could bring them, Esperanza said, Yes, please, bring lunch now. The men and women dressed in their hats and fancy clothes smiled and chuckled at what must have looked like a doting father and 2 privileged children. When they arrived in Zacatecas, a woman wrapped in a colorful rebozo, a blanket shawl, boarded the train selling mangoes on a stick. Mangoes were peeled and carved to look like exotic flowers. Papa bought one for each of them. On the return ride, she and Miguel, with their noses pressed against the window and their hands still sticky from the fresh mango, had waved to every person they saw. The wagon jostled them now as it hit a hole in the road, and Esperanza wished she could get to Zacatecas as fast as she had that day on the train instead of traveling on the back roads hidden in a slow wagon. But this time she was buried beneath a mountain of guavas and could not wave to anyone. There was no comfort, and there was no Papa. Interesting flashback, and here's the next part. Esperanza stood at the station in Zacatecas, tugging at the second-hand dress. It didn't fit properly and was the most awful yellow. And even though they had been out of the wagon for some hours, she still smelled like guavas. It had taken them 2 days to arrive in Zacatecas, but finally that morning they left the wagon hidden in a thicket of shrubs and trees and walked into town. After the discomfort of the wagon, she was looking forward to the train. The locomotive arrived, pulling the line of cars and hissing and spewing steam. But they did not board the fancy car with the compartments and leather seats or the dining car and the white linens. Instead, Alfonso led them to a car with rows of wooden benches like church pews facing each other, already crowded with peasants. Trash littered the floor, and it reeked of rotting fruit and urine. A man with a small goat on his lap grinned at Esperanza, revealing no teeth. 3 barefoot children, 2 boys and a girl, crowded near their mother. Their legs were chalky with dust, their clothes were in tatters, and their hair was grimy. So basically, they're riding third class. They're taking the train with the poor people. An old, frail beggar woman pushed by them to the back of the car, clutching a picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe. This would be like the Virgin Mary. Her hand was outstretched for alms. Alms means, give me some money, please. Esperanza had never been so close to so many peasants before. A peasant is a poor person. When she went to school, all of her friends were like her. When she went to town, she was escorted and hurried around any beggars. And the peasants always kept their distance. That was simply the way it was. She couldn't help but wonder if they would steal her things. "Mama," said Esperanza, stopping in the doorway, "we cannot travel in this car. It is not clean, and the people do not look trustworthy." Esperanza saw Miguel frown as he edged around her to sit down. Mama took her hand and guided her to an empty bench where Esperanza slid over next to the window. "Papa would never have us sit here when Abuelita wouldn't approve," she said stubbornly. "Mi hija, it is all we can afford," said Mama. "We must make do, and it is not easy for me either. But remember, we're going to a place that will be better than living with Tio Luis, and at least we'll be together." The train pulled out and settled into a steady motion. Hortensia and Mama took out their crocheting, and Mama was using a small hook and white cotton thread to make carpetas, or lace dollies, to put under a lamp or a vase. She held up her work to Esperanza and smiled. "Would you like to learn?" Esperanza shook her head. And why did Mama bother crocheting lace? They had no vases or lámparas to put on top of them. Esperanza leaned her head against the window. She knew she did not belong here. She was Esperanza Ortega from El Rancho de las Rosas. She crossed her arms tight and stared out of the window. So Esperanza is pompous, she's spoiled, and she believes she's better than other people. So far, these are not Christian values. For hours, Esperanza watched the undulating land pass in front of her. Everything seemed to remind her of what she had left behind. The nopales remind her of Abuelita, who loved to eat the prickly pear cactus sliced and soaked in vinegar and oil. The dogs from the small villages that barked and ran after the train remind her of Marisol, whose dog, Capitan, chased after trains the same way. And every time Esperanza saw a shrine decorated with crosses, flowers, and miniature statues of saints next to the rails, she couldn't help wonder if it had been someone's father who had died on the tracks, and if somewhere there was another girl who missed him too. Esperanza opened her valise to check on the doll, lifting it out and straightening her clothes. The barefoot peasant girl ran over. "Mona," she said, and reached up to touch the doll. Esperanza quickly jerked it away and put it back into the valise, covering it with the old clothes. "Mona, Mona," said the little girl, running back to her mother. And then she began to cry. Mama and Hortensia both stopped their needles and stared at Esperanza. Mama looked across at the girl's mother. "I am sorry for my daughter's bad manners." Esperanza looked at Mama in surprise. Why was she apologizing to these people? She and Mama shouldn't even be sitting in this car. Hortensia looked from one to the other and excused herself. "I think I'll find Alfonso and Miguel and see if they bought tortillas at the station." And then Mama looked at Esperanza and said, "I don't think it would have hurt to let her hold it for a few moments." "Mama, she's poor and dirty," said Esperanza. But Mama interrupted. "When you scorn these people, you scorn Miguel, Hortensia, and Alfonso. You embarrass me and yourself. As difficult as it is to accept, Our lives are different now. The child kept crying. Her face was so dirty that her tears washed clean streaks down her cheeks. Esperanza suddenly felt ashamed, and the color rose in her face, and she still pushed the valise farther under the seat with her feet and turned her body away from Mama. Esperanza tried not to look back at the little girl, but she couldn't help it. She wished she could tell the little girl's mother that she had always given her old toys to the orphanage, but that this doll was special. Besides, the child would have soiled it with her hands. Mama reached in her bag and pulled out a ball of blanket yarn. Esperanza, hold out your hands for me. She raised her eyebrows and nodded toward the girl. Esperanza knew exactly what Mama intended to do. They had done it many times before. Mama wrapped the yarn around Esperanza's outstretched hands about 50 times until they were almost covered. Then she slipped a string of yarn through the middle of the loops, and tied a tight knot before Esperanza removed her hand. A few inches below the knot, Mama tied another snug knot around all the yarn, forming a head, and then she cut the bottom loops, separated the strands into sections, and braided each section into what looked like arms and legs. She held the yarn doll up, offering it to the little girl. She ran to Mama, smiling, and took the doll and ran back to her own mother's side. The mother whispered into the girl's ear. Shyly, she said, "Gracias." "Thank you." "De nada, you're welcome," said Mama. And the woman and the children got off the train at the next stop. Esperanza watched the little girl stop in front of the window, wave to Mama, and smile again. So before she walked away, she made the yarn doll wave goodbye too. Esperanza was glad the little girl got off the train and took the silly yarn doll with her, and otherwise she would have been reminded of her own selfishness and Mama's disapproval for miles to come. So as we can see, Mama is compassionate, but Esperanza is still very spoiled. It's a long chapter, so I'm reading a bit quicker. Clickety, clickety, clickety. The song of the locomotive was monotonous as they traveled north, and hours seemed like Mama's never-ending ball of thread unwinding in front of them. Each morning the sun peeked over one spur of the Sierra Madre, sometimes shining through pine trees. In the evening it set on the left, sinking behind another peak and leaving pink clouds and purple mountains against the darkening sky. When people got on and off, Esperanza and the others changed their seats, and when the car filled up, they sometimes stood. And when the car was less crowded, they put their valises under their heads and tried to sleep on the benches. At every stop, Miguel and Alfonso hurried off the train with a package. From the window, Esperanza watched them go to a water trough, unwrap an oilcloth, and dampen the bundle inside. Then they would wrap it in the oilcloth again, board the train, and put it carefully back into Alfonso's bag. "What is in there?" Esperanza finally asked Alfonso, and the train pulled away from yet another station. "You will see when we get there," she smiled, and knowing look passed between him and Miguel. Esperanza was annoyed with Alfonso for taking the package on and off the train without telling her what was inside. She was tired of Hortensia's humming and weary of watching Mama crochet as if nothing unusual were happening to them. But most of all, she was bored with Miguel's constant talk about trains. He chatted with the conductors. He got off at every stop and watched the engineers. He studied the train schedule and watched to report it all to Esperanza. He seemed as happy as Esperanza was irritable. "When I get to California, I'm going to work for the railroad," said Miguel, looking anxiously toward the horizon. They had spread pieces of brown paper on their laps and were eating pepinos, cucumbers, sprinkled with salt and ground chiles. "I'm thirsty. Are they selling juice in the other car?" asked Esperanza. "I would have worked at the railroad in Mexico," continued Miguel, as if Esperanza had not tried to change the subject. "But it is not easy to get a job in Mexico. You need una palanca, a lever, to get a job at the railroads. I had no connections, but your father did. I was a small boy. He gave me his word that he would help me, and he would have kept his promise. He always kept his promises to me. At the mention of Papa, Esperanza felt that sinking feeling again. She looked at Miguel. He quickly turned his head away from her and looked hard out the window. But she saw that his eyes were damp. She had never thought about how much Papa must have meant to Miguel. It dawned on her that even though Miguel was a servant, Papa may have thought of him as the son he never had. But Papa's influence was gone. What would happen to Miguel's dreams now? And in the United States, she asked quietly, I hear that in the United States you do not need una palanca, that even the poorest man can become rich if he works hard enough. And that is basically one of the definitions of the American dream. So we're going to pause there, and that'll be kind of like half the chapter, and we'll do the next video, the other half of the chapter. So we left off on page 75. So good job, guys, and I hope you're enjoying the novel, as I am.